national delusion that we're important, which prevents us from being happy. If we only stopped fantasizing about being important, we can actually be quite a successful country.
Everyone agrees that Britain is in trouble. You can call it decline, you can call it being broken. Doesn't really matter. The story is generally a bad one. People on the left think that, people on the right think that. None of the above generally agree as well. The country's heading in the wrong direction. Today's guest has been on twice before. He's from a very different part of the political spectrum to myself, and it's fair to say most of my colleagues here at Novara Media. But he's useful in terms of probing points of ambiguity, even potential agreement, and refining my own thinking, at least, in terms of the big questions, not just today, but also in the recent past as well. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the Mail on Sunday columnist, and I think one of the best conservative commentators out there, Peter Hitchens. Peter, welcome to Downstream.
It's always a pleasure once I've found the place.
Once you found the place. The barber boys are back.
Yes, indeed.
You did indeed come here with your barber today, didn't you?
I did. It was okay this morning when I left home, but it's becoming a bit hot now.
Yeah. I find this is the perfect time of year for a barber, April. Because it might rain, it might be windy, it might be sunny. It's just
well, you wait till this afternoon. Try riding your bike in it.
You're going to get a bit hot.
You'll get hot. Anyway, we didn't come here to discuss clothing.
We might get on to barbers made in Britain.
I'm not interested in clothes.
Really?
No, totally honest. I once wrote an article about it.
I don't believe that. Actually, wearing a nice barber jacket. But anyway, you must be somewhat interested.
No, I'm not completely honest. As long as they cover the necessary things, I just don't care.
Did you know that the bottom of the zip on a barber opens a bottle? Did you know that?
I've never tried, but
it does.
Just useful to know.
Yeah, circular with a little angle, and you can open a bottle cap. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, I taught Peter Hitchens something. That's not many people can say that.
No. It's always interested in ways of opening bottles. It's important to know.
Serious business. What do you make of the Keir Starmer government so far? We're a year in. How have you been surprised? Have you been surprised?
I've not been surprised.
For better, for worse?
I've not been surprised. I'm interested to see how they did it. I think that there really hasn't been all that much interesting about it. There's obviously, ever since the COVID panic, there's been an immense desire on the part of the state to take more money from people. And they have been doing that, and that didn't surprise me. And I've thought since it happened that we would probably end up with some sort of wealth tax or some sort of confiscation of private money on a large scale, because they simply can't carry on as they are without it. But so they've moved closer towards that than the previous government were. The most interesting things have been the attack on private education. Now, as you possibly know, I'm not that keen on private education. I see why people do it, but I think it's overrated. But on the other hand, it's the only escape a lot of people have had for a long time from a very, very bad state educational provision. And the attack on it has been heavily dogmatic and futile and unpleasant. And that's been quite interesting, watching Bridget Phillipson working hard on that. And then the foreign policy development, very, very rapid outbreak of early onset foreign mania by the Prime Minister. He started going abroad very fast. And then the Trump developments, which have turned him into a sort of warmonger.
So that has surprised you or no? Or the rapidity of it has
surprised me. I wouldn't, if you'd been asking me to predict silly things the government would do, I wouldn't have predicted that because I didn't know what Donald Trump was going to do about the Ukraine war. And indeed, even if I had known, the response of the British and French governments has been so wildly irrational that I don't think anybody could really have predicted it. Even old Moore's Almanac couldn't have predicted it. It's so weird.
But Labour are presently polling low to mid-20s. Yeah. In some polls, 22, 24. I know you don't think polls matter, but surely...
I do think they matter.
Yeah,
I think what people don't realise when they read them is how many people are left out who simply don't give answers because they don't know or don't care. And also how polls are designed to produce the answers which they do. Almost no poll is held. There's no independent institute of polling which sets out purely with with a totally open mind to find out what the public think. All polling is conducted for a purpose and serves its master. That doesn't mean that the facts which are gathered in a dishonest way. I found the polling organisations very honest and very helpful whenever I've dealt with them, but it does mean that the way the questions are arranged and the timing of the polls and the nature of the people who display and publish them has some influence on what they say. And it's intended to. Polls are intended to influence public opinion, not to measure it.
So polls that show Labour, say, 2 or 3 points behind Reform, what's the purpose there then?
Well, I don't really know. It would depend on who was publishing it. But what I would say is that you should bear in mind the nature of the person who's publishing it, and you should ask if you're at all interested to look at the original polling work, which may show something slightly more interesting. But in any case, polls a long way from elections have even less meaning than by-elections. They don't mean anything. People will say anything. If you actually go to the voting public, even now, this is still true, if you actually go to the voting public at a general election as a candidate for one of the major parties, your chances of being elected are about 1 million times more than that of an original individual person, even if you're saying what people would quite like to hear.
But do you accept that Labour have become quite unpopular quite quickly?
Yes, but of course they have, but they weren't very popular in the first place. They weren't elected out of popularity. They were elected in an unpopularity contest with the Tories, and they were less unpopular.
But you're not surprised that they've become even more unpopular?
No, I'm not.
So you foresaw all of this?
Well, no, I don't foresee it. It's just I don't find it terribly interesting. I find Westminster politics almost as uninteresting as I find, say, association football. I mean, really dull. I'm not interested in it.
But it's not, is it Westminster politics?
Yes, it is.
No, but
that's only people who are interested in Westminster politics are preoccupied by how many of the different so-called parties will occupy how many seats in the next parliament.
True.
Because it won't actually affect very much.
True, but at the same time, that data reflects a level of antipathy with regards to our political process more broadly, which isn't new, but it's getting more profound.
People are normally antipathetic towards their governments.
I don't think
that's usual.
This much?
People like to be moan. Why wouldn't you? The country is in a mess. The government is supposedly responsible for the state of the country. So why wouldn't you moan?
But I suppose the response to that is the country.
I must just tell you here about Jan Masaryk, the great Czech politician, was asked when he was in exile during the Second World War what his war aims were. And he said, I would like to go to Prague. I would like to ride down Wenceslas Square in a tram. And I would like to say, and here he put on a quavering old man's voice, and I would like to be able to say, I don't think much of the present government. This is the nature of democracy. That's what you're allowed to do. And many years later, I was in a tram in Prague in 1978, and I began a political conversation with my companion. He said, for goodness sake, shut up. You can't talk about that here. So there is a difference. You can moan about the government. That's what people do. And if you're asked by an opinion pollster if you'd like to moan about the government, you will take the opportunity if you've got any sense. It might conceivably make a difference, but it doesn't mean anything of any interest to me. I'm interested in the future of the country, not in the superficial frigging about of parliamentary politics.
But yes, but you've got a political system in this country, which we've already covered the antipathy thing. That's not new. That's generalised. I broadly agree with that, though I think it's worse now than it's been in a very long time. At the same time, you've got a government which is now carrying out a host of policies they never mentioned before the last general election.
I said that. I spent
does
a
undermine
month
trust
before the election seizing every opportunity to get a microphone or a publication I could find saying, look, these guys are they're not telling you what they're going to do, but you're not going to like it. Don't help them in.
But that's not democracy.
Well, I don't know exactly what democracy is.
Well, you're saying it's about being able to whinge in a square. I agree with that.
I'd say that is what, in effect, it is about. It ought to be about other things, but I regret to say that's more or less what it boils down to. We don't like the present government. We'll vote for another one. I wish it were more sophisticated and more effective, but that's more or less what we are now reduced to. We swap governments because we get cheesed off with the old one. And the new one, to get in, has to be unforthcoming about what it's going to do. If they'd said what they were going to do in detail, no one would have voted for them. So they didn't. But it was quite obvious. There's no... The laws on telling truth in advertising don't apply to political advertisement. or to political statements. There is no obligation on it to tell the truth. That should be warning enough, really, shouldn't it?
So are you despondent with democracy?
Should
we replace it?
I've always thought that liberty under the law was the most important guarantee of civilization. I'm equivocal about democracy, as have all the major democracies been in their time. The United States Senate, I don't think, was elected until 1913, and that was deliberate. The founding fathers didn't want a second elected chamber. They wanted it to be immune from what they call the fury of democracy. In this country, we had the House of Lords and also numbers of other restraints which prevented direct democracy from taking place. Direct democracy has not tended to be a huge success where it's been adopted. All successful democracies have been moderated by various forces of one kind or another. That's the nature of it.
Switzerland?
Oh, well.
Great country.
Yes, but the great difference between Switzerland and all the others is that the referendums it holds can only be initiated by the people and not by the government.
But we could do with the Swiss system, right?
I think the Swiss system works very well for the Swiss, but not everybody is Swiss.
Right.
The Swiss also have, for many, many, many years, been armed. They keep weapons at home. I can think of a lot of countries where that wouldn't be a good idea.
Interventions in the conversation about Gaza are hugely important. I'm having one on April the 7th at Earth in Hackney with Ilan Pappé, an extraordinary man, an extraordinary historian. His work's focused on the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, particularly with the Nakba in the mid to late 1940s and the emergence, the growth of an Israel Zionist lobby on both sides of the Atlantic over the last 150 years. The authority on both of those subjects, as far as I'm concerned. I really hope you can make it to join us on April the 7th in Hackney. We've got some tickets left, not many. Try and get one. Try and bring a friend. His books will also be on sale. And I always say the best gift for a family member or a friend is a book which illuminates something about the world of real importance. I can't think of many things right now more important than what's going on in Gaza. Hope to see you on April the 7th. The link for that is in the description below. One of the things that's changed in the sort of broader conversation in the last 10 to 15 years is that I think now when people talk about democracy, the presumption was 15, 20 years ago, it is the best system, it will not be replaced. I think increasingly, even quite intelligent people on the centre-right, centre-left say, look, it's a historical formation contingent on a certain period in time. It came, it may leave.
A total untrammeled democracy is a very rare thing and doesn't tend to last very long. But the moment I start thinking publicly about it, someone would immediately call me a fascist, or at least they used to. When I first started saying, well, look, I quite like the idea of some people having more votes than others, which I do. And by that, I don't mean rich people. I mean people with more life experience. I mean people who've successfully raised families. I mean people who've made a payroll. I mean people who've served in the military and people who've shown bravery under fire. Them getting extra votes, I think that would be an excellent system.
So how would that work?
Well, it would work in the way that I say, that you get more votes if you've got more life experience and can prove that you're a more responsible person. Up to, I don't know, there's a very enjoyable novel by Neville called In the Wet, in which it's actually imagined taking place, and it completely alters this country when it's introduced. And that's the point of it. It makes people less biddable, less easily defrauded. You have a greater number of people who have the wisdom to see through false promises and to see through demagogues. I think there's nothing wrong with that. When I used to say this, and that universal suffrage democracy threw up the most terrible leaders, such as Sir Anthony Blair, people, I say, would start saying fascist to me. And it was only after the European Union referendum and the first election of Donald Trump, I didn't get so many people calling me a fascist for suggesting that unrestricted democracy might not necessarily be the best system of running the country. Liberty is much more important, and the maintenance of liberty, people with liberties of assembly, speech, and thought, are vital for free civilization, and the rule of law is vital as well. And these are tremendously precious possessions, and democracy is often hostile to them.
So this is really interesting because I think there's a bit of a tension here in what you just said, because you argue for the criminal justice system to be much harsher. It's gone soft, but you also criticise the police for overreach.
Oh,
so there's a tension.
Was the use of the phrase "gone soft"? You make me sound like the Daily Express.
No, but there's a tension there between wanting a strong, competent
I left
state
a quarter of a
and
century
liberty.
ago. No, it's not a matter of gone soft. It's actually gone quite hard in a number of ways. Let's just say quite a lot of people, far more than ever before, now end up in prison. A dismal experience, but they arrived there at the wrong moment in their criminal careers. What we've done is we've made prison a measure of last resort used in desperation after people have already become habitual criminals, and therefore it does not work. We've also abandoned any kind of efforts against prosecuting one of the most dangerous offences in our society, which is the taking of illegal drugs, especially marijuana, which I strongly suspect is the cause of the huge amount of the violence we see around us. And so but it's not a matter of going soft, it's become stupid.
So
if you fall into the hands of it, and particularly if you're wrongly convicted, as I think growing numbers of people are being, if you fall into the hands of it, it's quite tough. You wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it. Prisons are not holiday camps. On the contrary, the worst thing about them is they're largely run by the inmates rather than by the authorities. But they are. It's not that it's gone soft. It's that it's gone useless. It doesn't face the problems that it really ought to be facing.
But the tension.
I wrote a whole book on this, which nobody read.
I don't think that's true. I've certainly read it. You're talking about the abolition of liberty?
I am. Yes.
Yeah, I've read it, Peter.
I retract that. Almost nobody read.
I think the abolition.
I placed that book in the hands of honestly of commissioners of the Metropolitan Police and serving Home Secretaries, and begged them to read it. And indeed judges at the Old Bailey, and begged them to read it. And not one of them's even written me a note back saying thank you. They didn't read it. They just chucked it in the bin.
Didn't the abolition of Britain sell like 100,000? I know it's different.
The abolition of Britain.
That sold like 100,000 copies.
The abolition
no?
of Britain sold a lot of copies. Yes, the abolition of liberty did not.
But then you say nobody reads your books. Not many people sell 100,000 books.
They don't. People, the people buy books and then don't read them. It's not. If authors' success were measured by the amount of people who read their books, it would all be very different. I'm convinced, for instance, millions of people buy the books of John le Carré, but there's no sign in the English middle classes thinking about foreign policy and all the things that those books delve very deeply into, which suggests they've actually read them. I've read them. They're fantastic. They're incredibly intelligent about these issues of foreign policy and the standing of this country and the futility of an awful lot of spying and the fantasy land in which the British intelligence services live. And if you've read them, you know about it. But the way people respond to all kinds of junk, which come whenever the BBC put on a former chief of SIS, which they do all the time, nobody sits and thinks, as they would if they read John le Carré, this man is trying to pull one over my eyes, because they don't. So if they're reading it, then they're not understanding it. I think they buy it and then they don't read it because it's too difficult for them. People
are buying John le Carré and Peter Hitchens for their shelfies. Just take a little picture, Instagram, and then not read it.
I wouldn't like to accuse my readers of that necessarily, but it is very odd, the John le Carré phenomenon. Those books are tremendously educational, and they're in many ways autobiographical, and they're one of the most powerful, the Looking Glass War, about the fantasy land of British intelligence, which they simply delude themselves about how important we are. It's the most devastating read. And nobody could actually read it without being deeply affected, but I never get the sense anybody has.
Do you think people are reading less now than they were 30 years? Well, we know people are reading less now,
because people can't read functionally in many cases. They've grown up in a world where books are things that other people read. And I must be one of the last people who actually reads books for pleasure.
Do you believe that?
Why are you looking under the table?
Pardon?
Why are you looking under the table?
No, because I'm you're one of the last people that reads books for pleasure.
They don't.
I don't.
People read when they have to. A lot of people. I'm very, very careful when I publish books to make sure that there's an audio version available, because that's probably the best way of ensuring that people under 40 will actually experience the book.
Do you know Penguin Classics' best-selling book last year?
No.
White Nights by Dostoevsky.
Okay.
Something strange is happening, Peter, with young people.
Yeah, I've not read that.
And I think there is neither have I. And I think there is...
Do you know what it's about?
I've no idea. I think it's an existentialist novel.
I think we should find out.
It's an existentialist novel. It's quite short, like a lot of his stuff.
That could be a reason.
Yes,
short
but
books is where so many poor children have had John Steinbeck's, not his actual worst, but one of his worst books, Of Mice and Men, inflicted on them because it's so thin. It's the same with The Great Gatsby, this supposed classic of American literature. Everybody has to read because it's so thin, because schools don't dare ask children, even quite advanced A-level children, to read books which are thick anymore.
Do you know what I'm reading at the moment, Peter?
No.
Have a guess.
No, I can't. Too many. There are too many books.
It's 1,200 pages long. The Count of Monte Cristo.
Okay. I read, or believed that I read that at the age of 9.
It's great. It's a children's book.
Yeah.
It's a 1,200-page children's book.
Yeah, I remember bits about
It's
it.
so good.
The Count does not eat muscatel grapes. I remember that very strongly. But a lot of it has slipped away. The Chateau d'If.
Yeah, there you go.
I visited the
really?
Chateau d'If. Yeah.
Is it nice?
It's a nice boat trip, I must say.
This is where the who becomes the Count of Monte Cristo is held in prison. I don't want to spoil
it for anybody who hasn't read it.
Okay. He gets out. There was a really good BBC adaptation about that. So you think even the liberal intelligentsia don't bother to read books anymore?
I'm sure of it. I'm absolutely sure that that book reviewers don't read books.
Really?
Totally. If ever I'm asked to review a book, I read it. It takes weeks, sometimes months. I take copious notes. I mark the book. It's unsaleable afterwards. But I won't be any more specific than this, but I have strong reason to suspect from personal experience that my books have been reviewed by people who have not read them on occasion.
I certainly think the person at the Times who reviewed my book hadn't read my book. Which you'd expect better from the Times. I think the FT review was...
It's difficult reading books. You really have to take time. I've been asked by an American magazine to review Angela Merkel's memoirs. They are not an easy read. I am still 100 pages short at the end, and I've been at it now for about 3 months. If you want to read a book like that properly, it takes time, even if you're a fluent reader, because you have to make notes on it when you're doing it if you're going to review it.
See, I just put exclamation marks. Pencil, of course.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No,
You use pen?
Red biro.
Really?
Sometimes driven deep into the paper in rage. How can she say this?
I bet that's the case with the Merkel book.
It is.
Moron.
No, she's not. She's not a moron. She's intelligent, but she's so fantastically banal. That's the thing.
Well, there's lots of political leaders like that. Like
I know.
Nicola Sturgeon. She was a titan on the British political stage for a decade.
What drove her? What drove her?
Also, what's her legacy? Like now she's gone. What does she do?
The People's Republic of Scotland, isn't it?
No, but independence is no more likely than it was 15 years ago. I mean,
Well, maybe
before 2014.
Maybe independence was never the point. Lots of independence movements prosper by never retaining their goals. Look at Quebec.
But it is really interesting when you're in the thick of it.
Look at Catalonia. They're doing pretty well, but they just haven't got independence.
Is Catalonia
Independence
doing
is awkward.
They want fewer tourists. They're not very happy about that.
Well, so does anybody who lives in a tourist area. But I'm just making the point that nationalism doesn't necessarily want to achieve its goal or benefit by doing so. Imagine actually having to set up defense forces and a diplomatic service and a currency when you haven't got one. Difficult.
Too much like hard work. But you can make the same point in regards to Brexit and Farage, couldn't you? He didn't really want to win.
Well, I think I've thought for some time that the referendum became a referendum about something else. People like me who for years have said, look, actually it would be much better if this country were independent and made its own laws, which was basically my problem, that if we stayed in the European Union indefinitely, our legal system would be lost. And I think our legal system is too valuable to be lost. And that was the absolute clincher for me. Had almost nothing to do with the campaign. The campaign was about immigration. And I went some years ago to the town of Boston in Lincolnshire because a resident wrote to me and said, it's absolutely astonishing here, the level of migration that's going on, which it was, from Eastern Europe mainly. And I went and wrote about it. And then later on, I was asked by the regional BBC to come back after the referendum to see what had happened, because immigration had been such a big issue there. And what was quite plain was that everybody involved, both the residents and the migrants, had believed that the referendum was about making the migrants go home. And quite a lot of the migrants reported how the day after the referendum, or the week after the referendum, locals came up to them and said, "Why are you still here?" They thought that if they voted to leave the EU, all the migrants would go home.
Do you think?
Then they didn't.
Well, a lot more people came over.
That was yes, exactly. It wasn't. But that was the issue that took it over. And that was the issue that decided that was what people were voting about. It wasn't to do with the European Union at all.
I just want to take a quick break from this conversation to talk about the role of Novara media in the media landscape and how actually I think we're doing pretty well at shifting the debate in so many ways. We started this project with an understanding that politics is downstream from media and that to change politics, you have to change media first. The older I get, the more incontrovertible that is. If you want to shift politics in Britain and beyond, you've got to start with the media. Start with Novara Media. Help us continue to build this organization. Take the conversations we have to an even broader, bigger audience. Go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. £1 a month, £5 a month, £10 a month, £100 a month. I don't mind. I don't care. Get on board. Help us build a new media for different politics. We were talking about people becoming disenchanted with democracy. I mean, this, again, I do think this is unprecedented, Peter. Like you say, you have a massive constitutional exercise in this country, animated for people that voted to leave, primarily by migration. And then in 2021-22, you have over 2 years, net migration to this country, 1.6 million. I don't think anything like that's happened before. I don't think anything, or the same with Keir Starmer, 14 years of the Tories, we have to get rid of them, no return to austerity. Actually, I'm going to take, infants' school meals away from them. We're going to make £5 billion worth of welfare benefit cuts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It does feel like we're in this new stage of British political life where the lying is incessant and the mistruths are greater than ever.
Yeah, it is probably more intense. It's what I think the term that was invented for it when the Blairites really went for it in the 1990s was manipulative populism. You have your own actual agenda of things you want to do. You don't talk about it very much, or you put it in code, or it's hidden away in policy documents to which you refer, which you don't widely publish. And then you come up with slogans such as tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, or education, 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 on which you sell your party in the elections. It was also amazing, and you can still watch it, one of the last television broadcasts before the 97 election put out by the Labour Party actually stated that the Tories were going to abolish the old age pension. It's a flat, outrageous, gigantic, Himalayan-sized lie. But no one, it was just broadcast.
On TV?
Oh, yeah. I remember watching it. I was exhausted. I'd been out on the campaign trail, as it's called, and I come back to my hotel and I was sitting exhausted in front of it, and I switched on the television and this thing, I wasn't expecting an election broadcast, and this thing came on. And it's the Land of Hope and Glory broadcast in which the Tories are caricatured to the tune of Land of Hope and Glory, but the claim that they're going to abolish the old age pension is made in subtitles on the screen. I've written about it. You can look it up. It's very easy to find and watch. They did it.
And probably the people, the ad agency that devised that are the same people that talk about post-truth.
Well, I suppose they do. But that is the most blatant lie I've ever seen told in an election. I mean, everybody does it, but there's lying and there's lying.
Do you think Nigel Farage can be the Prime Minister?
Do I think?
Nigel Farage.
No, I don't. I don't think Nigel Farage should be a member of Parliament.
Could.
He could. Oh, could. Who's ruling anything out now?
Do you think he could? I'm asking you. So presumably you do think he could be?
Well, as I say, I can imagine circumstances in which it might happen. But since we're heading at, I don't know what speed at the moment towards, and have been for many years, towards a major economic catastrophe, what happens when that breaks, who knows? And I think the only way out for an awful lot of people in this society is very, very, very high level of inflation. And that changes everything.
So you think we're heading to some sort of economic cataclysm, which could
see it wouldn't necessarily need to be a cataclysm. One of the things about my experience of living in the dying days of the Soviet Union and the early days of Yeltsin Russia is that I know that catastrophes can happen. That when they happen, the sky doesn't turn bright orange, the moon doesn't turn to blood, the people continue getting up in the morning and going to bed in the evening. It's just life is totally, utterly transformed for the worse for very large numbers of people, and they have to live with it. So the trouble with the use of the word catastrophe is it makes you think of some kind of apocalypse.
But hasn't that already happened? Like
in bits to some people, yes, but on the scale on which it happened, for instance, to the Russian people, no.
No, of course not.
You haven't woken up and found that your savings have just been abolished.
Of course not. But this country, compared to 20 years ago, and I think it's lost on young people, is completely different. It is completely different in terms of the ability of the government to deliver services, everything. High streets.
I agree with you, yes, but again, all this was predictable. Its root is in. It's not actually in politics. I mean, there are elements of it which have been politically driven, and the left in this country do have a cultural revolutionary agenda which changes huge numbers of things all the time, and some people like it, and I happen to be one of the people who don't, so I notice it more. But the real problem is the national delusion that we're still a great power in a rich country. We believe figures showing us to be among the richest countries in the world, but they're the wrong figures. They're figures of GDP instead of GDP per head. If you do us on GDP per head, we plunge down the league table of wealthy nations. We think that because we have, or believe that we have a nuclear deterrent, that we're a major military power. But we're not. Did you see what happened last week?
You tell me. Was it another failed Trident test?
Well, it wasn't another failed Trident test. No, I think it'll be a while before they try to test it again, because the danger, if for a third time the missile fails to function, then everyone's going to begin to ask the question, which I think the answer is quite obvious: does it actually work? But what happened was that one of the Trident boats came back from so-called patrol, which involves lurking underwater for several months in a part of the sea that we're not supposed to know. And it came back. There's a very good photographer who films these things on the Clyde, came back and covered in barnacles and slime and looking really quite embarrassingly shabby and dingy. And the reason for this is that she'd been on so-called patrol for more than 6 months. She left port to go on patrol in August. None of the people on board had seen daylight since August. And the reason for this was because the replacement, which was supposed to go out and relieve her, had taken much longer to refit than had been expected.
It's meant to be every 3 months, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not officially stated, but the tours of duty used to be about 3 months max, yes. And submariners used to have, if you liked that sort of thing, quite a reasonable life. You knew how long you'd be away, and roughly, and you knew when you'd come back.
Yeah. Good money as well, right?
Good money, good domestic life, predictable life. You could be home with the kids for quite a while, and then you had to be away, and then you came back. Now it's unpredictable. You go away, you don't know when you're coming back. And this was a record. This was, I think, 204 days. I know. So there's something seriously wrong. All those Trident boats should have been retired by, I think, 2019. I think that was their original retirement date.
But they've been extended, right?
They've been extended because the replacements have barely been begun, and the work has begun on them. But the official date for their introduction is 2032. And knowing what we know about the dates of delivery of Royal Navy vessels, I think we can be pretty confident that won't be met.
Do you think they will? Do you think they might not be delivered at all? Or
do I think
they might not be delivered at all?
I have no idea, because again, if we run into a severe economic crisis, this incredibly expensive aspect of our defence budget must come into question. It would if I were in Whitehall and had any influence over it, it would be one of those never let a good crisis go to waste things. It would be a good point to say, surely we don't need this superpower Cold War weapon anymore, because we're not a superpower. And say what you like, there isn't a Cold War.
What's the rationale behind? I mean, I know we have to have a permanently at sea deterrent, but the reality is the Russians have 5,000 ICBMs.
Well, that's also because the Russians have a huge landmass, and they can scatter it about and hide it.
No, I appreciate that, but 5,000, they could literally obliterate this country.
We have a tiny landmass. I think there was once some famous diplomatic party at which Khrushchev bulged up to some British diplomat and said, we could destroy your entire country with 4 bombs. And it's true, because we're so compact. whereas to do similar damage to Russia would require much more firepower because it is so much bigger, and also it's got large areas in which land-based weapons could be moved about. There's a strong rationale for having it at sea, but I often point out that Israel has a sea-based nuclear deterrent, but it's nothing like as elaborate as ours. It's much more compact and modest. And the French, I think, supplement their at-sea force with air-launched cruise missiles. In my view, the things are unusable anyway, but since we've spent so much money on actually constructing them and learning how to make them, and I'm sure that if called upon to work, the bombs would work. It would be silly to throw that expertise away, and also we'd lose if you gave up having one. You wouldn't be allowed to start again. Do you know the origin of Britain's nuclear weapons?
The nuclear weapons or the weapons
system?
system
Do you know why
we
we
now
have nuclear weapons in the first place?
Well, because Bevan was being bullied by his American counterpart.
That's right. Yeah, we did it to assert independence of the United States. It was nothing to do with the Soviet Union. It's quite funny. In 1946, he'd been out for a meeting with James Burns, and the Americans had also pretended that they hadn't promised to share their nuclear secrets with us. I think a Quebec agreement, or they'd lost the agreement or something, so they wouldn't. They basically cut us out of their nuclear research. So we had to do it ourselves with a certain amount of string and chewing gum.
So the national delusion goes all the way back to 1946.
But actually, on that case, Bevan, who was much smarter than most modern politicians of any party, could see that if we were to maintain, which of course at that stage we could still realistically claim to be, the status of world power, we had to have one. The point is, has the moment passed when we needed to do that? But to me, the Security Council seat, the G19 or whatever it's called, summits, and all the rest of it, the special relationship, are all parts of the national delusion that we're important, which prevents us from being happy. If we only stopped fantasizing about being important, we could actually be quite a successful country.
I'm going to return to that. That's an interesting proposition. But in terms of British decline, you often focus on, from your perspective, the Cultural Revolution, changes in social mores, etc., since the 60s. But I suppose alongside that, what you're hinting at, for instance, with our inability to maintain Trident properly, etc., is just a basic capacity to do things well has been lost, technically.
In a lot of cases.
When did that happen?
Well, I think a lot of it was due to the destruction of the grammar schools. And what the grammar schools did, they didn't do it as well as they should have done because there weren't enough of them. But they did do it to a great extent, was that they found talent and they educated it to a high standard, and they sent talented people on either to vocational occupations where their talents are fully exploited, or to university where their agile minds were made as agile as possible. And people were taught not what to think, as they generally are now in our schools, but how to think. And since 1965, when we abandoned that system of education, it's gone. In my childhood, it was standard talk when faced with American braggadocio to point out that a set of English A-levels were probably worth rather more than an American college degree. No one says that now. And there was a thing called the brain drain, particularly in science, where big American companies would recruit British-educated people to go and work for them. And again, you don't hear about that much.
There's a lot of UK founders of major tech companies in the US.
Yeah, but it's not quite the same thing.
We still do it. I mean, I think is it one of the senior people at Slack, for instance? I think maybe even the founder of Slack is a British national.
I'm not denying there's still talent in the country. On the contrary, there's massive talent in the country.
DeepMind, etc.
It's much harder for it to get out because an awful lot of our talent is thrown away in dreadful secondary schools. And indeed in primary schools, which for many years have refused to teach children to read properly.
So you would say that Britain's inability to just maintain basic infrastructure, to build cheap energy, cheap HS2, to maintain defence infrastructure in the way that one would expect, etc., that can be traced back to getting rid of the
Some
grammar
of it
schools.
can. I'm not a single cause merchant, and a lot of it can be traced back to the privatisation frenzy of the Thatcher period. And that destroyed, for instance, our civil nuclear capacity. We had very good civil nuclear expertise and abilities before that, and now it's gone. It seems to be almost impossible for this country to build a nuclear power station in less than about 25 years.
Yeah.
And
We
even
can't.
then we have to get somebody else to do it.
We can't. We need the French. Yeah, we can't. And even then, actually, there's a question about the cost with the French doing it. They can't compete with the cost of the Russian and Chinese.
But we used to do it very well. And that was thrown away. That's an example. And in lots of areas like that, we just destroyed the talent that had accumulated as well. There have been many, many mistakes made.
What was something that the political class got right in the last 40 years?
Can't think of one.
One thing.
Well, I can't think of one, no. If you've given me notice to the question, I might have delved.
No, I was just responding to what you said.
I don't want to be unfair, but I can't offhand think of any. I look back on it as a landscape of half-witted stupidity.
Do you think that's your... Because you make very compelling arguments for a lot of things. Do you think that's your...
I know, it's terrible, isn't it?
Do you think that's your personality type, or do you think that...
No, I don't.
You think that's just an objective assessment?
Lucky, just lucky, I guess. I just happen to have been fortunate in having been lived on into an era where the general level of discourse is so dim that I look like an intellectual.
I think you're a very funny guy. I've always said this.
Yeah, most people don't spot that either, you see. It's kind of you to say so, but there will be people who will take the remark that I've just made totally seriously and miss the fundamental point of it.
Libs on Twitter, Peter.
I know. Well, I gave an interview to Times Radio the other day about Ukraine. And it's very good. Stig Abel is an intelligent guy, and it was enjoyable and thoughtful, and an interview which ranged over the subject properly. If you look at the below-the-line comments on the YouTube version, it's just a seething mass of prejudice and rage. It's pitiable. These people can't cope with a position previously unknown to them. They don't say, "Oh, I haven't heard this before. Perhaps I should look this up." They say, "I haven't heard this before. The guy must be in the pay of the Kremlin."
Is that new?
No.
Do you think people have always been like that?
I mean, it's not new in the below-the-line comments.
No, but I mean...
in which we live.
No, but during your life, you're born in the 50s. I do feel like now, if people encounter an argument they haven't heard before, the general default is this person's an idiot, or you know, they've got some vested interest, or...
Well, it's not... Look,
rather than taking the argument on its own
There have
merits.
always been poorly educated people in this country. But the point that I make about the grammar schools is that there was at least a layer of the population which came from everywhere, which came from the poor back streets as well as from the middle class suburbs and among the rich. There was a layer of people who were educated to think and to have their minds open enough to do so and to debate against opponents in a way which allowed them to acknowledge when their opponents were right. The whole principle of the government of this country is that you have an opposition party. Which will at least some of the time be right, and will be able to show that it's right and that the government is wrong. And that's one of the reasons why we have had so much success in the past, the adversarial system. I believe very strongly in adversarial things. I even had an adversarial family.
Is it an education thing, though? Because some of the most...
Well, education is an important part of it.
Of course.
I am preoccupied with the education thing.
But hold on.
I just happen to know a bit about it. Now I've written a book about it, which nobody has read. I know more about it than I did before.
Well,
It's worse than I thought.
One of my observations about where we are now in the 2020s, I don't know about 50 years ago, is that some of the most closed-minded people I know are highly educated, and some of the most open-minded people I know didn't stay on at school after 16.
But what do you mean by highly educated?
Well, the people you're talking about, highly credentialed, technical qualifications,
years. But that doesn't mean what it used to mean.
Of course,
because they did not have the kind of teachers that I used to have, who encouraged dissent and made it clear that they valued it. For instance.
Yeah, I think that. So that's my question, really. I think we've lost the idea of a culture of dissent being a good in itself. I think we've lost.
You can have a PhD and not be able to argue. I mean, you frequently encounter it on social media. People actually say, "I've got a PhD," and you say, "Well, that's great, but you still don't understand what I'm saying."
No, I think it's a profound shift. And actually, people are saying now because of...
So what I'm saying is high paper qualifications don't betoken what I would regard as a good education. I think a lot of people came out of grammar school in the 1950s and 1960s better educated than they come out of university now.
Are you a fan of oral exams? Because people have to argue then, right? rather than written ones?
I can see that in some cases. I can see the great universities often used to use them to decide the grade of someone's degree. When they couldn't make up their minds, they call people in for a viva voce exam, and you can see why. But it's very individual, isn't it?
I think I prefer it, especially in an age of AI, etc. Assessing people
Well,
where
some people can't stand it. I mean, some people are just terrible at exams and hate them. I mean, my late brother hated exams and always had nightmares over his exams and generally did very badly in them, which gives you an indication of what an unreliable measure of intelligence and ability they are.
Talking about Christopher, where do you think politically he'd be now? Or do you not even dare to think?
I think his interests were mainly in foreign policy. I think he'd be on the opposite side to me on the Russia question almost for certain. Because he's a believer in utopian intervention. Was a believer in utopian intervention.
You don't think he would have discarded that by now?
I don't actually know, because I think it was what he was discarding was the former utopianism of the international socialists that he embraced, because it obviously didn't work, for something else, and he found a new utopia in the reform of the world by regime change. And I think that's where he would still be. I don't think there'd be any reason why he would have had an epiphany about that since then.
He was a bright man. I mean, you'd look at
Afghanistan
and Iraq, and
who would dream of denying that? He was extremely bright, but bright people can get things wrong, particularly if they're very passionate. And he did get very, very fierce passions about things.
I think
he didn't want to be there when he lost his temper on the subject very much.
Yeah, I bet. But I think this boils down to what we're saying about education and highly educated and less well-educated formally, is that lots of highly educated people seemingly believed that we could export democracy to countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. And a low IQ take would be, how about we focus on actually enhancing the quality of democracy in this country? That was viewed 20 years ago as a sort of provincialist, insular mindset, but I think it's the right one.
It brings us around to where we were. What are the actual elements of democracy, or at least of desirable government, generally, which goes under the name of democracy? There are a lot of people mistake. I mean, Hong Kong, for instance, when it was under British rule, was barely democratic at all, but it was immeasurably freer than the People's Republic of China just across the border. And that was because, say, of the rule of law and the existence of free speech. And those were the things which the Chinese dictatorship went for when they came over. The democracy element was never particularly important. The fuss was made about it by some people. That was what really changed. And the rule of law has gone there, and liberty has gone there, and that's the major loss. Now, I'm not saying some sort of adversarial system, some sort of elected legislature is important, and I value it. I think the House of Commons is a hugely important part of our constitution, but how it's selected and all the things that go with that are more important. For instance, in some continental countries, particularly in Scandinavia, they don't bother to have, for instance, an adversarial architecture in their parliament. People just sit anywhere. Whereas in our parliament, it's always been the case that the one party sits on one side and one on the other, which promotes an adversarial system and the formation of opposing parties, which I think is a good system, provided those two parties are genuinely separate, rather than being more or less the same and united against public opinion, as they have been in this country for some years now.
But the media seems to cheer that.
That's the thing that went missing. It's not that democracy went missing, it's that the adversarial system went missing.
But the media cheer that on, don't they? I mean, the media seem to cheer on two parties that are effectively the same. They seem to think that's grown-up politics.
Well, I think, as I say, I spent some time covering British politics in Westminster when it wasn't as bad as it is now, and I came away. I'd longed to do it. I spent much of my life as a trainee reporter in Swindon and Coventry thinking, gosh, I wish I could be in Westminster reporting on the real stuff. Finally arrived at Westminster, got my lobby pass, was able to go to the secret briefings and all the rest of it. And I've actually never been so disappointed in my life at the banality of it. And it's much worse now than it was then, too. It was all gossip. Who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down. What was actually going on in the government of the country at the time passed most of us by, I think.
See, I do blame the media for quite a lot of that, Peter, because they...
Well, so do I. I don't, but then again, the state of your media will be a function of the state of your education system. The media, if you want to have independent media, it's a devil's bargain, but it's been a good bargain for most of the time. You have to have a commercially successful media, because if it's not commercially successful, it won't be independent of the state. And if it's to be commercially successful, it has to be popular. It has to appeal to the population and their what they desire. And of course, it has to be in some way consistent with their level of education. If the level of education falls, the level of what the media are able and ready to discuss will fall. So you go to the British Library Archive of British newspapers and first look at the Daily Mirror of the early 1960s.
Great paper.
Extraordinary, and aimed clearly, and with a daily sale of 4 million, and aimed clearly at educated and thoughtful people. It's absolutely astounding to think this was the dominant popular newspaper of the country at the time, but it is so.
But if you look at Murdoch comes to this country, he buys the News of the World in 68, right? I think.
I can't remember.
68,
I think he becomes, but he's obviously his influence has been considerable. But interestingly, these dates around about the time that the revolution in the education system in 65 begins to kick in terms of who's coming out.
So that's what you would say. You'd say that the Murdoch media is responding to changes in.
I think I suspect that the watering down of the education system made it much easier for the Murdoch style of journalism to become popular. Yes, I do.
But then if you look at, Fox in the US, for instance, this is a process which is bigger than just the UK.
Yes, I know, but
Australia,
you stick to one subject. I mean, the United States is
it a global phenomenon?
The United States is a totally different country from this one, and it's the first thing anybody who goes to live there, if they've got any sense, realizes that trying to treat America as a big England is a huge mistake. It's just not the same.
The point about the Mirror is, I think, entirely accurate. I think it's actually it is frightening when you look at the quality of journalism in this country.
It's
60 years ago.
To see what you used to be able to, and there was the great when the first Lord Northcliffe founded the original Daily Mail. He used to hire these brilliant young men from Oxford and Cambridge to be his leader writers. And leader writers were in those days very important people, and some of them would start by trying to talk down to the readers and use overly simple sentences and words. And Northcliffe famously called them in and said, "Do not try to place upon the table of Demos what you would not place upon your own. Don't patronize these people. They know stuff and they can think." And it was one of his principles that you treated the readers with respect on that. He knew what they were interested in. You may have seen Andrew Rolls' biography, which is actually quite interesting, on the subjects in which people were interested, whether health, crime, and all the rest of it, are more or less the same now as they were then. He spotted that. He was brilliant, a genius of commercial acuity. He knew what would sell papers, but the stuff was not written to patronize people, or did not assume that they were stupid. It was a much higher level than that.
There's a consensus. Britain's heading in the wrong direction. The left thinks it for a set of reasons. The right thinks it for a set of reasons. And that's not new. If I was to say, Peter Hitchens, there's a new government. We're going to get you in the cabinet. You'll be made a peer or something like this. What's the number one problem facing the UK? We want you to tackle it personally. What is that area that you're going to, zone in on for the next 5 years?
Well, I don't want to be boring and say the obvious, which, given our conversation so far, because I would almost certainly say that restoration of quality in education through academic selection, but leave that aside and say I'm given a second subject. I would say the restoration of the stable married family as the principal unit in which people are brought up.
That's very controversial these days.
Well, nothing worth doing isn't controversial.
If you look at a country like Sweden, for instance, yes. I mean, they do have relatively high levels of children being raised outside of what you'd call a stable married family unit. And I don't think many people would say Sweden's an unsuccessful society.
Well, again, talking about Sweden now, as opposed to Sweden 10 years ago, is quite difficult. And it depends what you mean by success.
Well, high GDP, self-reported happiness, social cohesion.
Yeah, the fundamental reasons why these things grow up in a society, and they take a long time to go once they've grown up, is a high level of trust. And that's very powerful in the Nordic countries, I should say, to be correct. But on the other hand, the Nordic countries also have an extraordinary difference from countries like ours. Let's say they're basically city-states. They have very small populations, and they're extremely rich. And they didn't go through the nightmare of the Industrial Revolution, which particularly Britain, France, and Germany and Belgium went through, and the appalling class divisions and slum housing and general social disaster which that caused. They didn't go through that, so they have advantages which we don't have.
And what you think that left
international comparisons are fascinating, but there are an awful lot of things which people often fail to take into account when they make them.
Well, it's not the whole story, of course, but
the Scandinavian countries are, and again, I correct myself, the Nordic countries are not. Look at their populations and look at their levels of wealth. They are extraordinarily lucky, but they are not like us, and we could not be like them. We have different problems, and one of our most fundamental problems, I say, has been the Industrial Revolution, the creation of an urban working class, and then following that with the political act of genius of destroying the jobs that the urban working class did. They don't do them anymore because they've gone. The reason why Margaret Thatcher was so successful in defeating the trade unions is not because she defeated the trade unions, though the Act of Parliament involved was quite clever, but because she destroyed all the jobs, so there weren't any trade unions anymore.
So you think Britain's...
But you've moved me very quickly and a long way away from my point about the restoration of the stable married family.
No, because we're trying to ascertain... We're trying to diagnose the major problems with the UK, and you know.
Well, fatherlessness is one of them.
There's no panacea.
Fatherlessness is one of the really great problems which you face.
When did you arrive at that conclusion for the first time? When did it really hit you that conclusion?
Long ago, sometime in the 1980s, I expect, when it was just getting underway. But it's been confirmed ever since. The Himmelweis work as well on the moral decay that the Victorian society was largely created, its lawfulness and its stability by Sunday schools and morality, and this of course is part of the strong family effect. But I don't have very much doubt that fathers. It's not a miracle cure to have a father. I mean, some fathers are appalling. Some are indifferent, but in the lives particularly of boys, the absence of a father is statistically bad news for their future life.
So is that your take on the crisis of masculinity, Peter, as you say? Well, it starts with fathers.
I think crisis of masculinity is a silly phrase, but I think that it's quite interesting to see people going on about this now. I dug it up the other day because I thought this seems familiar to me. The very same Centre for Social Justice, which was doing a thing on fatherlessness this week, did another one about 8 years ago, which I remember writing about at some length. It's not new, but it's not just the fatherlessness. It's also the lack of stability. It's the lack of privacy. Where there is no family, there is no private life, and where private life is gone, then two other forces dominate: the state and commerce. And people become entirely the subjects of state power and commercial rapacity. And also, where are they going to learn the fundamental things which people learn before they go anywhere near a school, the law and language and culture of their country and people? You learn it in family. That's where things are passed down. If there isn't one, if from your earliest youth you're cast out on a tossing ocean of social media rubbish and television, and you don't know who your grandparents were, let alone who your great-grandparents were or where they came from, and you never talked to them, you won't learn all the things that I grew up knowing as a matter of course.
So I suppose this combines, the absence of the family unit for you combines with the profusion of social media, smartphones,
well, they're much more powerful precisely because the family is so weak.
That's an interesting point. What age do you think somebody should be on a phone. I mean, you have
I tried to make this
you have a
point. I
smartphone.
tried to make this point in the abolition of Britain in 1999. And a passing remark which I made is not even as part of the argument, it's a statement of fact that one of the things that had happened in life was that central heating had changed the way people lived.
I love that one.
Yeah, but I was told I'd written a book about how central heating was bad. And that's how stupid public discourse is in this country. Honestly. So my brother was so appalled that by this idiocy, he didn't agree with almost anything in the book, but he actually dug up for me an essay that George Orwell had written in the Evening Standard, making precisely this point.
Just for our
just so that to say no, you're not the only person who said this. I'd actually got it out of I remember it well because it was one of the things discussed when I actually one of my A levels, which will surprise some people, was in sociology. And it was a point made in one of the many sociological studies of class and language in this country that the introduction of central heating had changed the way people lived. Obviously, it did.
Just to recapitulate that argument, which is
it's just so typical. You try to make a profound point about the nature of society. Oh, he's against central heating. I mean, honestly. And the temptation just to go home and forget all about it is quite strong when you come up against it.
Really?
Oh, it's so stupid.
I think a sensible person would think.
What's the point of debate in which nobody else, apart from you, is debating?
Yeah, but I think the median person who's quite sensible would just say, "Oh, that's a really interesting point. I've not thought of that before."
I still get people telling me that's what the book was about, and it's now 26 years since I wrote it. I still get people saying this moronic thing. They don't know what's in it. Most of the people who attack the book don't know what's in it and don't even know what kind of book it is.
As a historical materialist, I have to say, I enjoy that point, Peter. The idea that, conditions determine consciousness.
Well, of course they do.
Well, there you go.
Historical materialism isn't all wrong.
We're halfway there. Peter Hitchens, the Marxist. It's just the rest of it.
You forget that I'm on a long, as they say, journey away from it. You're not going to drag me back to
pull you back in like
drag me back to that. Thank you very much.
But you were a Trotskyist.
I was.
You were the wrong kind of Marxist.
Well, some people would say that. We, of course, would have said it about other Marxists who weren't our kind of Trotskyist. But you know what Trotskyism is. It's excuse making. You're saying, yes, well, of course, the Soviet Union is a complete disaster, economic basket case, secret police everywhere, Stalin. But if only Trotsky had been in charge, it would have been okay.
Well, quite.
Well, it's a fantasy, isn't it? It would have been just as bad. Trotsky would have had more intelligent purges. That's about the big difference. He was smarter than Stalin. He would but it would still have been a hellhole because you can't make that idea work. Can
you briefly recapitulate the argument you made?
It's very simple. In the days before central heating, there was one warm room in the house. The one with the fire in it. And if you haven't sat around a coal fire, I'm sorry for you, but before central heating was common, which isn't all that long ago, there was one room and it had a fire in it and people gathered around it. And if you wanted to go up to your bedroom, you'd be freezing cold. Also, there would not be a computer in it because they hadn't been invented. But when central heating was introduced, it of course covered every room. So people who previously sat together, even if they were sitting, reading or knitting or whatever it was they were doing, then began to spend their evenings separately.
And that's when it all went wrong.
No, it's just a fact. I didn't say it was when it went wrong. I just acknowledge it as a fact.
That has huge implications.
Which it is, which is not, which had little to do with my argument. I just bunged it in because it was a fact, and some cretin decided to make out that what I was doing was arguing against central heating. So that's the level of debate in modern Britain.
But by extension, see, this is as somebody who's
it didn't even I just
inclined to technological determinism. It's very good.
As a fact, didn't have any particular point. It was just true. But if you then weaken the family, then you've got even that it becomes more important that this is going on.
So propositionally then, what? So, and again, let me play that person.
It's so simply not. I wish I hadn't put it in the book.
Why?
Well, because
I love it. It's one of my favourite bits of the book, Peter.
Because I wanted people to read the book and understand what it was about.
Well, I thought it was thoughtful aside.
It is not about that.
I thought it was a thoughtful aside.
It's about a number of decisions consciously taken by our society which changed it enormously, in my view, for the worse.
That's true.
And tracing those decisions to their origins. That's what I did. And
the book is about choices politically made,
It wasn't just a change in the climate or a tilt in the Earth's axis. It was deliberate actions by people wanting to change it. The most fascinating, which is probably the invention of the contraceptive pill.
Well, another technological shift, but I mean, rather different.
No, it was deliberate. It was the research was deliberately embarked upon with money from people who wanted to change the whole nature of life. It was deliberate.
What you're talking about, Margaret Sanger and people like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So again, what's the argument that you make there?
Well, it's the pill that cured morality was the title of my chapter. That if you once you separate once you separate sex from procreation, then you change people's behavior. You particularly change the behavior of women, and you make it easier for men to behave badly. Just as abortion, which is not such a major issue in the book, which I've looked at a lot since. The liberalisation of abortion was a charter for selfish men. It's amazing it's become a feminist cause. Well, it's different in so much as there were plenty of abortions before its decriminalisation, whereas the contraceptive pill is a wholly innovative shift. There were, but there weren't nothing like as many. There was a considerable number of abortions being done on the National Health Service before the 67 Act, which people don't realise. But what happened afterwards was that the number increased exponentially, and it became a form of contraception. In fact, in the USSR, where the law was even more relaxed, it became, I think, the principal method of contraception, and the number of abortions exceeded the number of live births.
So,
which is quite a striking statistic, I would think.
The things we're talking about, divorce, contraception, central heating, all the other stuff too. I mean, there's an argument to say that you're not part of your reporting, your journalism on that stuff, but in terms of your comment writing and your sort of big historical thinking, you're more of a historical writer than a political polemicist now. Because hold on, Peter, because it's nostalgia is not the right word, but you're basically talking about a historic civilization which is not coming back.
Well, is it? I'll tell you what happened to me. I became, having been for many years a reporter, a specialist reporter in education, industry, defence and diplomacy, politics, and then a resident correspondent in the Soviet Union. And I came back to this country and became an opinion columnist. And I said things, and people responded, and some people liked what I wrote and enjoyed it, and editors did as well, and I was given a position of prominence, and I became dissatisfied because I thought, I'm writing this over and over again, and it doesn't seem to be making any impact. And I spoke to people I knew. I thought, how on earth? I actually have ideas which I want to communicate, which I hope could be used to make society better or stop it getting any worse. And they said, well, you've got to write a book. To do that, you won't, until you've written the book, you won't get any traction with anything you say. So I set out to write The Abolition of Britain.
But no, hold on, you said
and what I did was I thought, the things that I've been saying are all very well, but I can't carry on just saying the same thing over and over again. I have to find out how these things happened and how the world changed. And so I became very much more interested than I had been before in the details of how things had taken place.
But you just said a moment ago.
That's what all my books are about this now. They take subjects on which I'd written many columns and spoken many times in debates and on television and radio, and I wanted to go deeper into the matter, and that's what they do. But historians do original research. I'm not doing that. I'm just I'm finding out what other people have researched, and I'm making links between it which others perhaps have not made.
But there's a diagnosis, isn't it? That's the point. You said a moment ago about
I think
proposals.
you have to know what it is that you're criticizing. You have to understand how it came about. You have to respect your opponents. You have to recognize, which I always do, the immense self-discipline and determination of the radical left in trying to change the world. I think if you want not to change it back, because generally that's impossible, if you want to counter this and to heal the wounds, then fundamentally what I used to think was that because the left was so completely in control of the culture, that the only way you could get anything done would be to change the minds of the left. And I worked on that principle for some time, and then I discovered that, again, I was wasting my time totally, because the response of most people on the left, people like me, was that I was an insufferable, wicked human being who they didn't want to have anything to do with. So any attempt to make progress through saying, okay, look, you must accept that even on your own terms, this has been a mistake. I think the clearest area where that is the case is in education. And anybody who believes in fairness and justice cannot look at the current British education system and not understand that it's now grotesquely more unfair than it was when we had selection by ability. What we have in this country is every March on National Offer Day is the most brutal selection by parental wealth you could imagine. If your parents can't afford to live in a good postcode, then you forget having a decent education in this country for the whole of your life. Nothing will change that. And the left are reduced to supporting this incredibly stupid idea. And I can't persuade them otherwise. But it's the fascinating thing, again, about the debate within the Labour Party about the abolition of grammar schools was there was serious parts of the left, particularly the Fabians and R.H. Tawney, who were in favour of keeping selection, and also some of the working class zones of the Labour Party, particularly the Northumberland miners, who had put an awful lot of effort into supporting grammar schools for their children in Northumberland and Durham, where they'd created a lot of very successful schools and done a lot of good, and they could see these going down the plumbing, and they objected to it. They were just bulldozed aside by the dogmatic egalitarian lobby.
Who bulldozed them? What social constituency bulldozed them? Because you're saying lots of bits of the left actually kind of agree with you. So where?
Yeah, well, it wasn't them. I mean, again, you'd have to look the nature of the campaign. A lot of the campaign came out of the Communist Party. The campaign for comprehensive education came out of the Communist Party and its front organisations, particularly among teachers.
So it wasn't Fabian liberalism. You're saying it was
Fabians. The Fabians in this particular case, particularly Tawney and some others, were highly sceptical of it. I haven't got the book in front of me. I can't look up the exact details, but it's the actual origin and centre and heart of the pro-comprehensive campaign in this country was done by actual card-carrying capital C communists.
My kind of people, Peter.
Are they? Interestingly, I mean, the schools in Stalinist Russia exercised a form of selection, but it was basically by back-squadding. If you didn't pass the class at the end of the year, you were held back a year. That's how they did it.
Well, it's interesting that the USSR took STEM really seriously. You're saying all of this.
The USSR and all the Eastern European countries had very serious education systems.
As does the Chinese, because
the Chinese as far as they settled their society. They'd had their revolution. They didn't need to use education as an instrument of revolution, so they used it as an instrument of the state to strengthen the state. Which is one of the reasons why so many, for instance, Polish workers came to this country after the European Union opened its borders to them, because the Polish education system was producing people of a much higher quality than the British one was. And they were very desirable. People employed them because they were good. So
let me get this straight. Communist education system under the Chinese Communist Party or the US...
I don't know about the Chinese one, but there's no question that the Soviet and the Eastern European schools were fundamentally good at producing people who could do things. I'm not saying that...
But then transplant that to a Western country with a liberal democratic system and the point becomes different.
People will find them very, very useful if they want skilled workers, for instance. That is what those countries train. I won't say that the communist countries trained their citizens to think very much. They bludgeoned them with Marxism-Leninism, but they were not trying to encourage dissent.
No, but this is interesting. So in places like the Soviet Union, there was an emphasis on technical aptitude, engineering, science, etc. We acknowledge that. But you're saying in a country like the UK,
and on literature, and they're fantastically well taught on literature.
Well, quite. Whereas here, you're saying because of the cultural element of it, actually it was about trying to propagandize a certain political worldview rather than the stuff the Russians want to teach their kids.
Oddly enough, I don't think anyone ever said that, though it has turned out that way. But because of course the preponderance, I think, almost certainly of teachers are of the left. So it's pretty likely that given any opportunity to propagandize, they'll take it. I would if I were them. But the fundamental purpose was social egalitarianism. that you could create a more equal society by making the schools more equal by abolishing selection. That's what they thought. The other reason was, of course, it was displacement activity. The Labour Party could not abolish private schools. It hated private schools, but it couldn't abolish them because you can't in a free country abolish private education.
That makes more sense to me.
So it's part of it, but it's not all of it. I mean, Brian Simon, I think it was the real leader of the comprehensive movement, was a very clever public school educated, university educated communist. And he was the pivot of the comprehensive movement. For instance, Max Morris, the communist president of the National Union of Teachers, another very prominent, I can't remember the name of one of the early comprehensive headmistresses in South London, again, another communist, very active people, and they had, it was an ideological thing for them. They thought that they could create a more equal society by destroying the grammar schools. They saw the grammar schools as some sort of privilege, which is actually the opposite of the case. But that's what was going on. But there were some people on parts of the left who were opposed to it on sensible grounds that, in fact, grammar schools were good for the children of the poor, which they were.
See, the thing is, Peter, if you talk to teachers today, and I talk to lots of teachers, they would say there are major problems with regards to the education system. There's not enough discipline. Parents aren't allowed to discipline children. Teachers aren't allowed to discipline children. So just the basic fundamentals of getting an education aren't possible.
Would they support any policy which would reverse that?
Well, I don't think they'd support the reintroduction of grammar schools, but I think they would say there's a lot wrong with the education system, and that the picture you're painting of them being effectively invested in propagandizing a worldview and that being coterminous with the idea of education. That's just simply not how we view the world.
Not the picture I'm painting. That was a subject you introduced to the discussion, and I agreed with you that there was a certain amount of this does take place. Bound to take place because in the nature of it, of the profession, an awful lot of teachers these days are of the left. But they're of the left, but they're very unhappy with how it works. When I was an education reporter nearly 50 years ago, almost all the advertisements for teachers appeared in the Daily Telegraph. Within 15 years, they all appeared in the Guardian. The nature of teaching changed. There were a lot more conservative teachers in this. And now they're not. One of the first effects of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s was not on the kind of people who ended up as Prime Minister and Defence Secretary, though they were affected. It was the much, much larger numbers of people who came out of the expanded universities of the 60s and went into teaching. And they were people of the left, because that's what we all thought when we were at university in the late 60s and early 70s. We were all people of the left, and it's not surprising. And the teaching profession changed. And if someone is of the left, then they're not likely to miss an opportunity to slip a bit of propaganda in when they're teaching. As I say, I wouldn't.
See, it's that historical materialism again, Peter.
I keep telling you, it's not entirely useless.
There you go.
As an explanation.
Let me put something to you. So you said a few moments ago about how you've got proposals for improving society. And I don't think you...
Making it less bad.
Yeah, I don't think you do. And that's not a criticism of you. I think some of the diagnoses you've written over the years are fantastic. Some of the observations, fantastic. What I think you do is you have an incredibly acute, and you don't have to agree with it, but it's a very acute, integrated critique of the society we live in, where it's gone wrong, whether that's education, whether it's the family, etc. And then by failing to engage in policy conversations in the here and now.
But with whom can I engage in
Hold on. You create a massive space for people who are probably far more radical than you, actually, far more regressive than you. Not that you're regressive, because you said you can't go back, and I agree with that. Even if you think the past was better, you can't go back, it's just fact. And I think you create this extraordinarily large space for people whose ideas you don't necessarily like.
Well, they have that space anyway. I didn't create it for them.
Well, but you're part of creating that space because you're one of the
I've never
most acute observers of post-Blair Britain.
So how am I helping?
That's a compliment, by the way.
How am I helping these people?
Well, because you don't participate in the policy debate on the centre right.
Well, how can I? I have no connection with these people. They're the Thatcher tribute band. I mean, I'm not a Thatcherite, as you will have noticed. I think she's one of the most overrated politicians of modern times. I think the personal story is very romantic. Gross's daughter becomes Prime Minister, and I think she had her character was in many ways estimable. I think she did an awful lot of damage. I'm not a Thatcherite, so I can't consort with them, and they don't invite me to their gatherings, and I'd be astounded if they did, because they know perfectly well I'm not their friend.
But I don't see Peter Hitchens saying the campaign to bring back grammar schools, Where is it?
No, they know. Well, it's implicit in everything I've written about. So they know that I'm not one of them, but my left-wing opponents and critics don't know. They think they lump us all together. They think I'm the same thing.
Well, I don't, but that's what makes it so interesting.
Don't, but let's put it like this: you're brighter than most of them.
That's very kind, Peter.
Well, I'm just a statement of fact.
That's very.
I'm not a flatterer. It's just true.
Well, that's certainly the case. You are a conservative in a way that's very legible to somebody in this country in the 50s, the 60s, as far as maybe the early 70s. Absolutely. But that's all the more reason then to be involved in the policy debate.
Yes, but there is no point. The point that I've said this many times. There is no transmission belt between what I think and modern British politics. I can't engage. What would I do if I wanted to for instance, find a political force which might either strengthen the married family or reintroduce academic selection in secondary schools? Where would I turn?
You could build a faction of a dozen Tory MPs around that and make it a coherent, cohesive political project.
What would they do, and who are they?
But people caucus in politics all the time.
Who are these people?
Well, I don't know. It's not my party.
Because I have no idea. I watch carefully the behaviours of Conservative MPs, and I see the one or two sort of grope vaguely towards the light, but they don't have a clue. Listen to the things they say. How are Conservative MPs selected? They're selected by seeing if they're intelligent and then rejecting them.
Well, it's not by associations anymore, is it? I suppose that's part of the problem.
Well, no. The associations are doing the bidding of the centre. I did join the Conservative Party for a brief period in the late 1990s because I thought I'm very much a constitutionalist and a rule of law person. I thought there ought to be a constitutional opposition to Blairism, especially you possibly don't remember there was rather alarming protests against fuel duty going up, which it seemed to me to be extra legal and quite dangerous, so that it's responsible for me, therefore, to engage in what I thought was democratic politics. So I joined my local Conservative Party. And it's not a political organisation. There is no mechanism by which the Conservative Party member can in any way. I had long ago belonged to the Labour Party as well, so I knew how these things work. There is no mechanism by which I could even have got a resolution put forward to the Conservative Party conference. I asked for a copy of the Conservative Party constitution. You know what happened?
Go on.
They said I couldn't have one. They said it was very rare, and if I really wanted one, I had to pay £150 for it.
You should join the Greens. They let you shape policy.
No.
You could,
you see,
have a word with Carl.
All you have to do in this conversation is to acknowledge that I have thought about this.
No, I know you've thought about it.
I thought and acted upon it. There was a famous occasion among some people when I actually put myself forward as an alternative candidate to Michael Portillo in the selection for the Kensington-Chelsea seat. This is when Michael Portillo was still what Michael Gove called the future of the right. And I didn't think he was. So I, in a stunt cooked up with one Alexander Boris Pfeffel Johnson, I put myself up for the selection for Kensington and Chelsea.
And what happened?
They didn't even interview me.
Did you ever want a political career within the Conservative Party?
No, I absolutely didn't. I'd been horrified if they had. But it was an interesting experience. They didn't even, I don't think they even wrote back, actually. I got myself put on the candidates list, which took quite an effort. I then wrote all the necessary letters, and that was it. I never heard from them again. They didn't even fancy having the laugh of having me along. So we need not even to that extent.
So we need a new political party.
My book was a bit notorious. This was the time in London when I had my first and forgotten great debate with Christopher. It's forgotten because I won it, and nobody likes to recognise that. You can still watch it if you want to, but it's much lesser known than another debate I had with him some years ago. And at that time, I was in a lot of diary columns. People were still prepared to mention me, and this Portillo business became quite prominent. Everybody knew about it, but a lot of people who ignored it completely were the actual Kensington Chelsea Conservative Association.
So you should start a new political party.
Well, there's a political party in this country is a body which is capable of winning parliamentary
Well,
seats.
Farage is doing it.
After all that, what's he got? Is it 4 of them?
Five.
Is it
Oh no,
five?
he's lost. You're right. No, he's lost low. Yeah.
And they can't stand each other. It's not the. There was an opportunity. You must know this. In 2010, and in the years before 2010, I regarded the David Cameron's takeover of the Conservative Party as a catastrophe, and I spent an awful lot of time. Almost all my energies were devoted to urging my readers not to support the Cameron takeover of the Tory party, because I saw it as what it was, as a Blairite coup. It was the Blairites taking over the Tory party. I said in the 2010 election, I begged my readers not to vote Conservative, because to vote Conservative would be to confirm this putsch. And I also begged a number of other supposedly conservative columnists and writers to support me in this, and not one of them would. And I addressed a meeting of the Bruges group in the Conservative Party conference, and I made this point there, and the temperature of the room dropped by about 30 degrees Fahrenheit because they were so hostile to the thought. They all said, no, we must support David Cameron. A man they came to hate in time, but were too stupid to hate when it mattered. And that was the point at which I despaired of politics. I mean, the takeover of the Conservative Party was a wreck, and not in any ways particularly worth saving. The best thing that could have happened would have been for it to collapse and for it to need replacing. But the Cameron takeover of it was a very hugely significant moment in British politics. That's why I wrote the Cameron Delusion. And it was my last real attempt to engage in serious politics, and I failed so totally that ever afterwards I regarded it as a matter of laughter rather than serious endeavour.
I've got one more question about Neville Chamberlain.
Yes.
Is he the most traduced person in the modern history of Britain?
I'm not sure the most, but he certainly gets a pretty bad going over. People don't understand what he was about. And he did make grave mistakes, but the slightly paradoxical thing, which I explore in another of my unread books, The Phony Victory, which everybody calls the phony war, infuriatingly, because it is not about.
I did that once, and no, you weren't happy.
It's just so. But anyway, in this book, I established that Neville Chamberlain, to some extent, Lord Halifax, to much more of an extent, actually wanted a war with Germany by March 1939, and it's forgotten that it was Britain and France which declared war on Germany in 1939, not the other way around. And that was the work of those two. Well, what they made very foolish assumptions about what kind of war it would be. They thought it would be a rerun of 1914-18, when the Maginot Line would just stop the Germans and Europe would be a stalemate, and the British naval blockade could then eventually bring Germany to its knees again. And they never thought that France would collapse in a few months, or that any of those things would happen. But on the other hand, and when it went badly, Halifax, I think, pretty certainly would have run for a deal if he could have done. Whereas Chamberlain, to his credit, was very supportive of Churchill when he wouldn't. And the greatest contribution that Churchill made to human history was to refuse to seek a deal with Hitler. But Halifax, I think, would have liked one, but Chamberlain not. So that's one way in which Chamberlain is wrongly traduced. The other way is that he's accused of leaving the country weak. In fact, as Chancellor of the Exchequer and as Prime Minister, he spent billions in today's terms on rearmament, but mainly on rearmament to protect the empire and to protect the home islands, and not on the sort of continental army you need to fight the war which he got in 1939. In terms of Munich, his appeasement, I mean, tell me, which is further east? Prague or Vienna? It's all right to say you don't know.
I'll say Vienna.
You would be, well, actually, you're right, but that's because you can see it's a trick question. But most people have no idea.
Yeah, I would instinctively think
once you realise that and look at a map, you can see that after Austria had become part of the Third Reich, Czechoslovakia was indefensible. All this stuff about the fantastic Maginot-type line they had in the Escovedo Mountains in the Sudetenland is inoperative, because if you travel, as I've done, from Prague to Vienna, you cross some of the most fantastic tank country in the world. And also you can see that forward German air bases on what had been Austrian territory and would then have been German territory would have made the country indefensible anyway. If there had been a war in 1938, I don't think Czechoslovakia would have had much of a chance. So then where would we have been, and what capacity did Britain have in 1938 to go to the aid of Czechoslovakia, given that it did 2 parts of damn all to aid Poland more than a year later? I doubt very much. But in the intervening year, I think the first Spitfire came off production in Southampton in summer of 1938. The first Spitfire, first production Spitfire, not prototype. So we didn't have really any of them at the time of Munich, and we had quite a lot by 1940, which you can put to Chamberlain's credit because he spent the money. He also spent the money on the Navy, building, amongst other things, the destroyers, which, despite the little ship's myth, were what saved the British Army at Dunkirk. So his folly was not so much in making the deal at Munich as in apparently believing in it. But many other people did too, and it was fantastically popular. You never see this. When they dig out newsreels of 1938, you never see this. The film must exist. When he came back, you see the piece of paper stuff at Heston. When he came back into central London, he was invited onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace by the King, who personally welcomed him and I think has sent a member of the Soldier Grenadier Guards in full uniform to convey this invitation. Chamberlain and his wife on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the biggest crowd since the coronation of 1937 in London, cheering, even though it's pouring the rain. And the only anti-aircraft searchlight then available in London trained on the balcony so people could see him as the dusk fell. In France, millions of people got a subscription to buy him a country house. He was the public view of Chamberlain after Munich was of an international and national hero. That anybody who said differently was in the sort of minority that I live in. So everybody who goes on about it almost certainly would have supported him at the time. And also the final point is that by far the worst episode of appeasement, the greatest episode of appeasement in Europe in the 20th century was not at Munich in 1938, but at Yalta in 1945, when Roosevelt, especially Churchill, who had no control over events, gave most of Eastern Europe to Stalin and secret police terror for, 40 years in return for being left alone in Western Europe. And if that wasn't appeasement, I don't know what was. Far, far worse, but nobody condemns it. Most people aren't even aware that it took place. So, yeah, Chamberlain is not my kind of guy. But I think that a lot of what's said about him is just simply inaccurate. And also, it's a constant, is the word trope? I never know what trope means, really. Whenever anybody says, actually, guys, I'm not sure this war has proved to be a good thing, let's not have it anymore, then immediately people start calling you Neville Chamberlain, and then they also call you Lord Haw-Haw. Or, in my case, a Kremlin parrot, which, as you would have seen, is exactly what I am not.
On the Chamberlain stuff, obviously that's the prism through which lots of people are looking at Ukraine, Zelensky, and people who are ambivalent about just marching into some sort of strong confrontation with Russia. Where do you sit on that? What do we do now with regards to...
I don't know. I know what we shouldn't have done. I know we shouldn't have done what we did. I know that we shouldn't have... The US Senate shouldn't have ratified NATO expansion in 1998. I know this because much cleverer people than me, especially George Kennan, the greatest American diplomat of the 20th century, came out of retirement to warn against it and said it would lead to a new Cold War. At the time, it was a folly. It didn't protect anybody. It created the very crisis it's now claimed to be avoiding. I knew that was wrong. And I knew that it was wrong for George W. Bush, a man who'd already distinguished himself in international diplomacy in Iraq so much that you would obviously hang on his every word, wouldn't you? He, in 2008, raised the idea at the NATO summit in Bucharest of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Now, given that a year before that, at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin had specifically raised the issue of NATO expansion and made it clear that he was extremely disturbed by it, you can't really rule out the possibility that George W. Bush, who must have had plenty of advisors who could have told him, was doing it deliberately to provoke. In fact, I think that he was doing it deliberately to provoke. I think that this was a provocation. And the stupidity of Putin was to respond to it. But if my beliefs had been followed, this wouldn't have happened. I can claim this in actual prophecy. In 2012, I went to Ukraine for what I suspect will be the last time. I'm not very popular there now. And I went to two places, well, three actually, Sevastopol, Crimea, and to the city of Donetsk, and to another small town called Gorlovka in the old dead coal mining districts, twinned with Barnsley. It has a Cafe Barnsley in it, or did have. It's shut now. And I wrote a piece saying there was trouble coming, partly because of the internal behavior of the Ukrainian government, which was beginning to treat its Russian-speaking minority with a certain high-handedness. And my only reward for that was to be excoriated by my old friend Ed Lucas, who publicly condemned me for writing what he called a terrible article. But there was obviously something going to go wrong there. But so my role might have been to say, don't make trouble in this extremely dangerous and risky region. What's the point of it? Why would you want to do that? I'll do this again because it works for me as an analogy. Ukraine, or rather the lands now called Ukraine, are largely Russian possession as a result of conquest and Russian expansion in the sort of Catherine the Great era, so before the immediate modern era. There's a similar position in North America. It's California, New Mexico, I think Utah and Nevada, I can never remember exactly the extent of it, are all lands stolen by the United States from Mexico in a war of conquest in 1848 that nobody outside North America has ever heard of, but everybody there has, and they certainly know all about it in Mexico. Now, if the United States had lost the Cold War, imagine if the West had lost the Cold War for some reason. Maybe the Russians had got to the moon first, the Russians had developed ICBMs, which we couldn't counter, the Russians had somehow found a way of destroying our economy. So let's think it possible this might have happened. The United States loses the Cold War and is in the position that Russia was after the USSR lost the Cold War. So it weakens. And it weakens globally and it weakens locally. So it loses control over its own immediate surroundings. So what happens? The lands which it took from Mexico in 1848 secede by referendum, so we don't want to be in the United States anymore. And they become an independent country, which contains the very important American Pacific Naval Base of San Diego. And the Americans, weak as they are, still managed to negotiate with this new country a basing agreement in San Diego. And there's a sort of standoff. And then the English-speaking people in this new country, whatever it's called, begin to be pressed to speak Spanish only and being told they can't work, that no jobs are open to them unless they speak Spanish. And this new country also says, we're joining an alliance with the Soviet Union, a military alliance with the Soviet Union, an economic alliance with the Soviet Union, and we're chucking you out of San Diego. Weak as it would be under those circumstances, what do you think the truncated United States would do under those conditions? I don't think it would do nothing. Given the record of the United States in intervening in its neighbors in that part of the world, I'm absolutely certain it wouldn't do nothing. Nations, whoever they are, nice, nasty, our friends, our enemies, don't like having hostile military alliances on their borders, and they don't like having their military bases taken away from them. And this is what's happening. So the best test of any policy is how would you feel if the other side did it to you, I was thinking.
I think we'll leave it there. Peter Hitchens, very enjoyable conversation. Thanks for coming on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.